Let's do this.
Throughout the 1860s into really the mid to late 1880s, we would on average have somewhere around about a half dozen resurrectionists operating in Cincinnati at any given period of time. And that's resurrectionist was the term that was used to refer to people who stole cadavers.
Well, the body snatching that took place was generally in more rural cemeteries, places where there wasn't a lot of traffic. And what would happen is that people would come soon after a funeral because you wanted the body to be as fresh as possible. So what you would do is they would come and they would dig a small hole at the head of where the corpse was. They break into the coffin, tie a rope around the deceased's head, and pull them out. Just pull them right out of the ground. And then they would sell these bodies. They would sell them to medical schools. And because Cincinnati has such a large population and it's kind of spread out over a large area, there was an opportunity to get a lot of bodies, not only for local consumption in the local medical schools, but also all over the country.
You know, body snatching was a common crime, and it was one that was a common crime, I should say, in the late 19th century, especially the 1870s and early 1880s. And it was a crime that was very much affected by race and class. What was going on was that the Civil War had revealed the inadequacies of medical training in the United States in the post-Civil War period. The number of medical colleges skyrocketed, the number of medical students skyrocketed. There was a desire to see doctors be better trained and to have a grounded understanding of anatomy. So there was a need to have cadavers that students could practice dissection on, but the idea of donating one's own body to science had not really taken root yet in the culture at large. So it wasn't always clear where those cadavers were supposed to come from.
Resurrectionists would steal bodies from a variety of cemeteries, but Potter's Field was most popular because it was the place where people were least likely to either be known or to have family members that had the financial resources to really kind of create a problem over it. And also because of that, there were frequently allegations of arrangements with the sexton, the caretaker of Potter's Field. And it was commonly believed, and almost certainly true, that often the caretaker would take a kickback from the resurrectionist when a body came in, rather than, well, when a body came in under ordinary circumstances, it would usually sit in this shed on the premises and then be buried the next day. You know, they would tend to come in the afternoon, evening, and then they're buried the next day. So they're above ground and pretty easy to get to overnight. So the sexton would, you know, have an arrangement with some specific body snatchers, and he would get a kickback for basically leaving that shed unlocked. And it's obviously a lot easier to sneak into a shed and take off with the body than it is to dig one up.
I would say probably the most popular place to obtain these bodies was the Potter's Field, and well, second or third to that would have been the Jewish cemeteries. Because of the Jewish burial customs, the bodies were ideal candidates in the Jewish cemeteries, and that given the lack of cemetery laws that would protect these bodies from being stolen, the Jewish community really had to figure out a way to handle that themselves by contacting the rabbinic authority and delaying those burials.
In 1878, John Scott Harrison's body was stolen, and there was a lot of outrage around that, and it was really kind of this outlier in stories about body theft. He is actually the only man in history to be both the son and the father of a United States president. This case was different because John Scott Harrison was both wealthy and relatively famous. And that's because resurrectionists did typically only steal the bodies of the poor, preferably the unknown. You know, the fewer family members you had, the better, just from a practical standpoint. You know, you had less opportunity for outrage and getting caught. So that's how most of the local people operated, and several of them even really considered that part of their code of ethics. You know, some of them really seem to have genuinely believed that they served an important function in the advancement of medicine. And actually they did. Not only did they believe that, so did the medical schools. In the late 1800s, you start to see the law being modified to make it easier for medical schools to legally obtain bodies. And what was called the Harrison Horror, the theft of John Scott Harrison's body, that had some influence, but it really was not as influential as a different case that we had in Cincinnati. And that was the Burking case of Avondale.
There was one particularly horrible crime that in 1884 that shocked public sentiment. Two experienced body snatchers named Ingalls and Johnson. It was Alan Ingalls and Ben Johnson committed a horrible crime. They went to the cabin in Avondale of a man named Beverly Taylor who lived there with his wife and their stepdaughter, and the cabin was in a lonely area of Avondale. And Ingalls and Johnson murdered the Taylor family and then drove their bodies downtown and sold their bodies to one of the medical colleges. This kind of crime, murdering someone and then selling their body, actually has a name. It's called Burking, after an Irishman named William Burke who pioneered the practice. And that was a case that just generated an immense amount of newspaper publicity. And I have wondered if maybe that case didn't sort of jolt public awareness and sensibilities and lead to more rigorous enforcement of the existing laws and greater observance of the way things were supposed to be done that were laid out in the 1881 anatomy law.
I would say that people need to care about body snatching because even though it's not a common problem today, there are still events today that are very similar. In the state of Ohio, it is legal for you to metal detect on known Native American sites, and in some ways that is the exact same thing as body snatching, because even though you're not stealing the physical human remains out of those sites, you are stealing grave goods, and those grave goods have just as much holiness and significance as the bodies themselves in certain cultures, and so this is still happening today.
Why these things, I guess, remain relevant still today is, for one thing, there's a lesson to learn about the legal system. You know, we didn't correct this problem through harsher punishment. We corrected it through smarter policy. And I think there's a broad lesson to learn there that's applicable to all sorts of things. Drug policy, for example. But it's also important from a kind of social equity standpoint. is pretty appalling to me. I mean, I think that it says something very unpleasant about American society and how much we connect the value of a human being to how much money they have. You can't disconnect those two issues of grave robbing and social equity and how we value a person based on their bank account.
There's a very famous quote, and it says, "The past is prologue," which is sort of like the things that happened in the past are the reason the things are happening today. It's that history, you've heard it said, often repeats itself. Well, it really sometimes doesn't repeat itself, but it is a good echo. And so we see quite often things that happened in the past reoccurring today. The debates that we're having on race, the debates that we're having about gender rights, the arguments that we're having about science are still very much alive today. So I think this is a debate about our general culture, as well as an interesting story of the past.